Welcome to episode 219 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Terry Kerns and former agent Bryanna Fox. In this episode, they review their investigation of Rick Van Thiel, accused of practicing medicine without a license. Dr. Terry Kerns and Dr. Bryanna Fox and members of the Las Vegas Joint Terrorism Task Force gathered evidence and witness statements that Dr. Rick was performing surgical procedures, including abortions. A former porn actor, he preferred to be nude while treating his patients/victims. He was also a follower of the sovereign citizen movement, which believes members are not subject to any government statutes, laws, or proceedings. This case had a surprising twist ending. Retired agent Terry Kern served in the FBI for 21 years. Terry, who has a Master's of Science in Nursing and a PhD concentrated in emergency management, worked an array of programs in the FBI, healthcare fraud, weapons of mass destruction, hazardous material, bombing, and terrorism investigations. Her last assignment was as the supervisor of the Joint Terrorism Task Force in Las Vegas, focusing on domestic terrorism investigations. After retiring from the FBI, she began her latest journey as the Nevada Office of the Attorney General's statewide substance abuse law enforcement coordinator. The primary focus of this position is to address the opioid crisis. Former agent Bryanna Fox served in the FBI for 4 years, 3 years as a research fellow in the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in Quantico, Virginia, and 1 year as a special agent. As a first office agent, she completed a rotation that placed her on the Transnational Organized Crime Squad and the Joint Terrorism Task Force in the Las Vegas field office. Currently, Bryanna, who earned her PhD from the University of Cambridge, is an associate professor in the Department of Criminology at the University of South Florida in Tampa. She is the recipient of the 2014 Excellence in Law Enforcement Research Award from the International Association of Chiefs of Police. As the title of the episode, Naked Fake Doctor, indicates, this is a bizarre case, and I guess the perfect episode to end what has been a bizarre year. Bye-bye, 2020. I do want to advise you that during the episode, we talk about sexual assault. Since this is the last show of the year, I want to say thanks for listening to the podcast and for purchasing and reading my books. As you know, I don't have any ads on this podcast. That's because I rather promote my own stuff instead of some corporation. I truly appreciate the support. My download numbers surpassed 4 million last week. I want to continue to serve my mission and spread my message about the FBI. So please tell a friend or two about what we have going on here. Next month, at the end of January, I'll be celebrating 5 years of podcasting with a special bucket list retired agent guest. No, not former FBI Director Louis Freeh, but I'm still working on that one. But I do have an interview scheduled with that other guy I told you about. I can't wait. So for now, happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. Stay safe. Now, here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, Terry Kerns and Bryanna Fox. Hi, Terry. Hi, Bryanna.
Hi, Jerry.
During the introduction of each episode, I read my guest's bio. And I am absolutely sure that listeners are so impressed that my guests today both happen to be women who have earned their PhDs.
Thank you.
But we will learn more about that at the end of the interview when I ask you when and why you joined the FBI and what you're doing now. And also to learn, Terry, about your connection to another one of my guests, Scott Decker, who I had on episode 115. We talked about Marathrax, recounting the anthrax attack. So you'll tell us more about your connection to him. So people have to stay tuned to learn more about those fascinating facts. But right now, we're going to be talking about is it a medical fraud case that was out of the Las Vegas division?
We tried to work it as a medical fraud case. Lots of twists and turns, which you'll hear about throughout the story. But overall, it was an unlicensed practitioner who was practicing medicine.
All right. So who wants to start? Would that be you, Terry, since you were the supervisor?
Certainly. I'm more than happy to start. This particular case, as I mentioned, it was about an unlicensed person who was practicing medicine, whose name was Rick Van Thiel. Mr. Van Thiel was known to the Las Vegas Joint Terrorism Task Force, the domestic terrorism side, because he was a known sovereign citizen. Sovereign citizen is basically somewhat of a political movement that believes that there's too many excesses in government and that the government doesn't have authority over what they do. And oftentimes they do not abide by all of the different laws that the rest of us abide by. So, for example, many are prosecuted for tax evasion because they don't pay their taxes. Or in Mr. Van Thiel's case, he was known to us because he didn't register his vehicles. So he had vehicles on his property that were unregistered and unlicensed. So they believe that they don't drive on our roads, but rather they travel on our roads. So they don't have to have their vehicles registered and have a license on it like the rest of us do, or pay the taxes to use those roads. So he was known to us prior to the particular case that we'll be talking about today with Mr. Van Thiel. He had previously been involved in a case with Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department where there was a plot between some sovereign citizens in Las Vegas to kidnap and kill Las Vegas Metropolitan Police officers. He being Rick Van Thiel, ended up not being prosecuted in that case because he did not follow through with the threats and kind of distance himself with the people who were planning that. So he was known to us. Mr. Van Thiel kind of fancied himself as a little bit of a Renaissance man, thought that he was, as we like to say, a jailhouse lawyer, and gave legal advice to many sovereign citizens and would go to their court cases with them and kind of act as their representative. He also became kind of a holistic practitioner. We had some stores, more natural stores, sprout stores that he would go to and try to get people into more holistic living. And he started doing these medical procedures, and he advertised to sovereign citizens. He would talk about doing sovereign citizen abortions. And basically what that meant was there would be no record of the birth because many sovereign citizens believe that you have a straw man and that your social security number is used by the government to make money off of you. So if he did these abortions, there would be no record of the birth or the abortion. So he would really target to like-minded people and also to some members of our society that were disenfranchised that, for example, couldn't afford health care, so would go see him for health care. And at this point, actually, I'll let Bryanna get into some of the specifics because she was a boots-on-the-ground investigator who spent many, many hours dealing with Mr. Van Thiel.
Bryanna, I do want to acknowledge that one of your neighbors is doing some home projects. So occasionally we're going to hear some sawing, some banging in the background, but we couldn't help that. We can't go tell your neighbors to be quiet.
Now, COVID home renovations are the thing right now. One of the first times that we heard about Rick was in that he was at Sprouts and other grocery stores, Whole Foods, those types of things, where he was trying to recruit people to come back to his home, which was a trailer on a property, sort of the outskirts of Las Vegas. And he was trying to recruit people for these types of holistic medicine, homeopathic medicine, treating ailments that they had. He was, standing around in the, vitamin section and trying to find people who had potentially, illnesses or ailments that they may be looking to treat. So on top of the sovereign citizen issues that, he obviously had in the past, he also had some prior criminal charges that registered him as a felon. So he was obviously not allowed to possess a firearm per state and federal laws. Fast forward in the case, we were looking into Rick for these, various complaints about him potentially practicing medicine without a license, as well as potentially possessing a firearm that he shouldn't be in possession of because of his felon status. And a search warrant was executed. At that time, they had reason to believe, because of his prior threats on law enforcement, as well as the fact that they heard he was likely armed and potentially heavily armed, SWAT was involved, and there were a host of other agents that conducted the search on his property. And this is really when my involvement on the case came to be, because in addition to a host of, medical devices and indications that he had been practicing medicine in that trailer on people, as we had heard, they found, a firearm, and there was also a host of documents that showed, it was almost like a check-in at a doctor's clinic where you write your name, your medical history. Rick was keeping very, very detailed records on all of the people that came in, and there were hundreds of them. So that's when I became involved in the case, because the other investigators who were at the search, who, recovered those documents, obviously needed a lot of help finding all of these people who, as Terry mentioned, were often the more difficult people to find in society. They were very transient. Some were homeless. Oftentimes, the reason they were going to see him is they didn't have jobs. They didn't have medical insurance. So they were going to Rick to be treated. On top of all of that, many of them were female, and they were, either involved in the sex industry, or they had very little support and guidance from family members. So they were going to see Rick to treat their ailments. And so having me as a female on the case was a benefit.
I think we may need to dial down as to what the federal issues were. What made the FBI get involved? And you talked about him not being able to have possession of a firearm because he was a felon. But there seems to be more that would target him for further scrutiny by the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Was it just looking at him as a potential future source that would provide more information about the sovereign citizen group and potential threats to the country?
So that's a great question, Jerry. And as we mentioned, Mr. Van Thiel was known to the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. And one of the detectives, task force officer on the Joint Terrorism Task Force, knew Rick Van Thiel very well and would often run into him at these court cases of other sovereign citizens that I talked about. And the original complaint that came into us from the medical board, because a complaint had been made to them that Mr. Van Thiel was practicing medicine without a license. So to your point about federal charges, we started to look at what federal charges we had on the practicing medicine without a license. So we started to look if there were any charges or billing to insurance companies or billing to Medicare, and he was not billing. Oftentimes what he would do for payment was he would barter for services or take cash, or in the instance of one case where he did a circumcision on a gentleman, he exchanged that services of him doing the circumcision for a gun. Now, he was a felon because he did have a prior violent type of history with the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. So he was not allowed to be in possession of a weapon. So we did look at that federally, but we even talked to our healthcare fraud squad to see if they would be interested in the case because of billing of Medicare or anything like that. But we couldn't find anything for the practicing medicine without a license on the federal side. So the main thing that we were looking at, of course, was on the Fed side was him possessing a weapon as a felon. As part of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the beauty of the task force is you do work with other federal, state, and local agencies. So we were also in communications with the district attorney in Clark County to see if there were any charges that could be brought against him at the state level. So not all of the charges or all of the cases on the Joint Terrorism Task Force necessarily have federal charges. We can go with the state charges as well, which is something that we looked at, and we talked to the assistant DA to see if this is a case that he would be interested in, which he was, because again, Mr. Van Thiel had been involved in some previous violent crimes like the potential abduction of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police officers. So he was known to the DA's office as well. We spent a lot of time really digging into what we could charge him with, if there was anything under the terrorism charges or any other criminal violations that we could use to look further into what he was doing. So we did do that. It ended up the majority of the charges did go through the state, through the district attorney's office. And the big concern was if he was practicing medicine without a license, we wanted to, number one, get that stopped so he wasn't, and ensure that he didn't endanger any people that were coming to him for services. So that was really our main thrust, was getting that stopped. One other thing that I'll mention is the property that Rick Van Thiel was living at was the property that was owned by another sovereign citizen. And Rick Van Thiel had basically a trailer that he lived in that was on the property of this other sovereign citizen. And this gentleman had his property basically like a compound. There was a gate, and you had to be let into the property when you came. He had numerous cameras around the property, and he had a boom tower that had lights and cameras at the front of the property so he could see who was coming and going from the property. So it was literally like a compound to get into that facility where Mr. Van Thiel had the trailer that he was doing the medical procedures in. And that was part of the reason that Bryanna mentioned that SWAT was used, because of the security, because it was known sovereign citizens that were known to have weapons and not afraid to use those against law enforcement. So it was not only the FBI SWAT, but it was also the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department SWAT that we used in order to get into this facility. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department used one of their Bearcats and basically announced who we were, what we were there for, and then broke through this gate that was on the property to clear the property, because there was the owner of the property in the house that was on there. There were a couple of trailers, like live-in trailer and a trailer from the back of an 18-wheeler that were on the property. So there was another person that was living in one of the trailers, and then Rick Van Thiel was living in the other trailer. And this property was quite messy. It had a lot of trash and junk and old cars, and it was an old horse property, and there was an outbuilding or like a barn that was in the back of the property that was filled with stuff. But it basically looked like going into a junkyard. And that was part of our concern too, that people were going into this very compound-like area to have medical procedures, and it was a junkyard, unclean, unkempt, not aseptic, and that's not even getting into the trailer that Rick Van Thiel was doing these procedures. And again, I'll kind of turn it over to Bryanna to talk a little bit about the trailer. And before I say that, one of the other professions that Rick Van Thiel had prior to getting into the sovereign citizen movement was that he was a porn actor. So he also had pornography. He had made some videos. He fashioned himself as an inventor and had invented a specific sex toy as well. So all of this really heightened our fear of what was going on in that trailer with these medical procedures. And I'll turn it back over to Bryanna.
Well, I do have to just say that he was definitely a man of all trades.
Yes, he was.
I think he actually used to say that himself. He was proud of that in his own weird way. But in terms of what it was like in that trailer, a disaster doesn't even begin to describe it. I mean, seeing like the video and looking back over some of the, the descriptions of the scene, it brings back, so many memories. It was almost like a nightmare scene where you have these, medical devices that are not sterilized. I mean, needles and scalpels and different, tools that he would use to cut out things from people's bodies and he would use to inject people. And on top of that, sex toys and weapons and just terribly disorganized and very unhygienic situation, all in this tiny trailer. So this ended up coming up a lot when we would interview people. We would be interviewing them and of course wanting to establish elements of the offenses that we were looking at prosecuting him for. On top of it, you have the human question, which is, why did you go there? Or when you got there, why did you keep going? And when you got up to the trailer and you saw inside, why did you keep going inside? And I think for a lot of people, our common answers were, they felt desperate. A lot of them felt like, they got there and they didn't know how to say no. And these things that were so human and you feel terrible for them. And especially because what he ended up doing to them and injecting them with and things that he had done that were just really horrible.
Did you say that some of the women also gave birth in that trailer?
I believe that there were births. The sovereign citizens, as Terry mentioned, would prefer not to give birth in hospitals or do it in a public, anything that would be on the record, because then they would have to get a social security number. So it would be like unplugging from the matrix in their minds by doing it in a way that they could not be on any type of government documentation or list. But what Rick was, I think, more maybe under our scrutiny for was the fact that he was performing abortions and the way that he would do it. On top of all of this, the fact that he was doing this with middle school education and obviously had no qualifications and no expertise in this. But on top of all of that, he would do things like perform these types of procedures in the nude. I remember when the first person told this to us, we were literally shocked. I of all the things, we had seen a lot up until that point, and that time we thought, oh my goodness, I couldn't even believe that. That was not on my list of things I even expected to come out of left field. But Rick would say he preferred to do it that way, liberated him. It helped him to, think and act better. So he would not only perform it in the nude oftentimes, but he would ask the patients that he was seeing, if they could be nude, or, sometimes he would even try touching them in inappropriate ways, particularly with his female clients. And on top of all of that, we had some reason to believe that he was bartering, sexual favors for these treatments that he was giving. So it was just this whole host of, inappropriate behavior, illegal behavior in terms of presenting himself as a doctor and performing these types of procedures. Absolutely just unethical, sexual behavior with his clients, assuming the best circumstances. He shouldn't be doing that anyway. And all is wrapped under this, very unhygienic and, very just, I would say, disorganized and dirty location he's performing this in. It was just a very, very bad situation.
Yeah, he definitely sounds like someone who needed to be taken off the streets. I just can't believe, that he was getting away with this type of behavior. How long do you know he was operating before he became subject of the Joint Terrorism Task Force there in Las Vegas?
He had probably been doing this for years, and I'll let Bryanna talk about the case review and looking at the files, but I just wanted to add something before we go on. Walking into the trailer where Rick Van Thiel was performing these medical procedures, it was a trailer that he also lived in, but it was like walking into a scene from the movie Saw, if that can give you any better description of what it was like. It was pretty horrifying when we went in there. And he claimed that he learned everything he learned how to do on these procedures by watching YouTube videos. and that you didn't need to go to medical school and all that because, you could learn all of this on YouTube, and that he was very well read and knew what he was doing. And also, one of the other things that concerned us is when he would meet people, and what he would claim is that he, through this holistic or homeopathic medicine that he touted, that he prescribed to, that he could cure things such as cancer and HIV. And that becomes important because there were a few individuals who went to see him that had either cancer and HIV, and he convinced them to stop their medical treatment that they were getting by licensed providers and to take on the treatments that he was doing. So we tried to see if we could get murder charges against him for this practice of taking on this homeopathic type of medicine and getting them to stop their traditional treatment. The problem is, from when the people died, is the coroner couldn't say exactly that what he did caused the death because they already had these underlying diseases going on. So, as a case, did the disease kill them or did stopping the treatment kill them? So we weren't able to go after the murder charges, unfortunately, although we did work on that with the district attorney's office to try to do that, but we weren't able to go down that route. But he had been practicing for quite some time and was under the radar because, as we mentioned, the types of people who were going to see him were either people, sovereign citizen, like-minded, that didn't like the government, so they weren't going to go to the government and complain, or people who didn't really want to get involved with law enforcement because they were maybe homeless, or some of the people who were in the sex trade industry in Clark County and in Nevada. So they didn't necessarily want to be on the radar with law enforcement. So it became really a problem for us, even in interviewing some of the, as we called it, victims, because they felt like they were getting a service that they couldn't get elsewhere from Rick Van Thiel. But I'll let Bryanna talk about some of the case reviews going back years that he had been doing this.
Yeah, we mentioned he kept meticulous files on all of these people. I mean, in some cases, we didn't have their addresses in our system because, as Terry mentioned, they were homeless or very transient. But, because Rick kept such great notes, it actually helped us to find some of these people. They did go back years, I think at least to 2013. His last charges were from 2013, but he had a website established, and he had, clients. I think he was building up his clientele, if you will, since around, it was 2012 or 2013. And he was expanding his procedures. So it started out as things such as doing coffee enemas, where he thought that was a way to, do like one of those treatments where you get all the impurities out of you and you can, feel better, look better, those types of things, which sometimes you can see those at health food stores and whatnot, but he was doing it to people, and it expanded from there. He had a YouTube video posted online where he was removing a cyst from a man, and Rick is actually in the nude, and as he's removing the cyst, you hear this man screaming because he's doing it without any anesthesia, probably incorrectly, using dirty tools, and people were coming to him and they would essentially say their issues, and Rick would either go on YouTube, try to figure out how to do it, and sometimes just guess his way through it and say, this seems easy to me. I know how to remove a cyst, without any training whatsoever. When we eventually interviewed him, I asked him about what types of things that he could do and what he was planning to do. And he said that he was watching YouTube videos to learn how to do open heart surgery. So that was, in his mind, his plan where he was going. It just was escalating rapidly. And he obviously didn't think that he needed any training or a facility, or, he had an almost godlike complex where he felt like he was capable of doing all of this. One of the other things that he did, which ultimately is one of the things that we were most concerned about, was called ozone therapy treatment. And this is another one of these things that is a homeopathic type medicine where you'll see people say, ozone in the air actually can help address various issues that people have. Rick expanded that and said he could use ozone therapy to treat cancer and HIV and some of the other issues that Terry mentioned. And obviously this is not true. Ozone therapy is idea. It's not proven. In fact, studies that have been done on it show it is not an effective treatment for these types of ailments and diseases. However, Rick was performing them on people anyway. The way that ozone therapy would happen is also very concerning because the way it was administered, which is taking somebody like you would do if you were donating plasma, taking their blood, running it through a machine, which supposedly oxygenates it or, puts ozone into your blood, and then taking that blood and running it back into the person. So on one person, maybe, hey, it certainly won't cure cancer and it definitely won't cure HIV, but hypothetically, at least that would be, contained to just that person and not potentially dangerous. However, Rick was not cleaning this. He was not cleaning the needles, and he was using it on multiple, clients or patients or whatever we want to refer to them as. And so if a person had HIV, he would take that same needle and then use it on the next person. So clearly you can see how this not just was a person who was practicing medicine without a license, but this is a public health hazard. This person is a super spreader in terms of these types of illnesses such as HIV, chlamydia, any type of sexually transmitted disease, any type of communicable disease. He was literally spreading from one person to another. And this is obviously problematic because if one person is immunocompromised, such as having HIV, and they now are receiving other additional illnesses from somebody else that he's treating with a different ailment, and now that's being injected in their blood, hugely problematic. And ultimately why we were trying to bring about murder charges, because he not only did this and knowingly, did not clean his instruments, but he would tell his clients that the treatment wouldn't be as effective if they kept seeing their doctor that was giving them treatments and medication. So he would try to encourage them to stop taking the medications from doctors and instead only rely on their ozone therapy treatment.
In addition to their health being compromised by his dirty instruments and this blood ozone transfer, what about the people that he performed surgery? I would think that infections from that or just botching the whole surgery would also send people to the emergency room and potentially death. Did that ever happen?
Yes. A young girl, she was, I believe, 18 or 19 years old when we went to talk to her. She had gone to see Rick because she was involved in the sex industry and she had gotten pregnant and she needed an abortion. She never met her father. Her mother was in prison for many years. So she was raising her younger brother by herself. And when she was pregnant, she was around 16 or 17 years old. So she went to see Rick to have this abortion. And when, Rick saw her, and not only did he, do his normal thing where he got naked himself and tried to get her to undress and be naked while he was performing the procedure, but he also did many other very unethical and inappropriate, and we were trying to prove illegal things, such as, putting his fingers in her in places that he didn't need to perform this procedure, doing things that were, for his pleasure, you could say, and nothing to do with the medical service he was performing. But on top of all of that, he also appears to have badly injured her because she had to go to the hospital afterwards because she was bleeding so profusely. And, Rick, of course, denied it and said that was just, part of what happens when you have an abortion. And he denied all responsibility, even when she went back to see him and tell him this. So she was very badly injured, and she had HIV, which when she was, 16 was when she, I think, got it. Perhaps from Rick, we don't know where the origins were. But by the time we saw her, she was, skin and bones. She was still taking care of her younger brother and, had this, injury, which she assumed she may never be able to have children afterwards. The really sad part of the story is by May, I remember when my partner told me she had died from lack of treatment and from her HIV.
And unfortunately, that was one of those cases where you were not able to prove that it was based on what he did to her and have him charged with murder.
That's correct. As Terry mentioned, you could have a really strong idea that but for his actions, she may still be alive. But on top of, what you think had happened, you obviously need to prove the elements of a case beyond a reasonable doubt to convince a jury that that was what happened. And so based upon the available evidence, we weren't able to establish that. So we couldn't charge him with that, even though in our minds, that was pretty clear what had happened.
Well, Bryanna, I'm wondering, because so many of these people were transient, you had mentioned, or Terry had mentioned, that he kept such great records. I would still think you would have a very difficult time locating these people. And then once you located them, because of their circumstance, getting them to actually talk to you and cooperate. Could you tell us a little bit more about that part of the investigation?
Yeah, up until this point, actually, I'd been on different squads. I was rotating through the Las Vegas office, and I had gone out and interviewed people. And when you say you're an FBI agent, most of the time you're pretty well received by the public. And that was very different in this case. Sovereign citizens are obviously not supportive of the federal government. And as an FBI agent, we were the front line of the federal government, if you will. So when we would go out and try to interview some of these people, even if we could find them, which was oftentimes very difficult, in a lot of cases, they were very supportive and defensive of Rick and did not want to talk to us. I thought of one other thing to share. In addition to the fact that when we did find people, they were more reluctant than usual to talk to us. Just finding people, because they were so transient and homeless, I got to know Las Vegas very, very well, particularly certain areas in Las Vegas. And we were so grateful and lucky to have a partner who was from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, because he spent years in the city, knew the city inside and out. And so, without him, I don't think we would have even been as successful as we were trying to find people who essentially didn't want to be found. A lot of these people would move around a lot. They were very, skeptical about law enforcement. They were fearful. They thought we were using this as some kind of a ruse or guise to, get information from them. And they just didn't trust us. So in some ways, having Ken and his experience and expertise was just invaluable. And then when we did find them, convincing them to talk to us and work with us was the second major battle.
How many people would you say that you interviewed for this case?
We had this list. We had this, gigantic Excel spreadsheet, which, I put together with all the records that were acquired from his trailer. And it was hundreds of people long. I think that there were over 300 people on the list. The other issue was that some of them had moved. Some of them we didn't know if they had moved or if they had died. They had died. Obviously, that was something we were interested in because it was their death related to this case. And finding them and trying to prove all of this is very difficult. People think you can just type a name into a locator or search engine and see, are they still alive? Are they dead? Where are they located? It's not like that, and especially when you are trying to find people who are very transient, things that we normally use, such as, where are their utilities? If they move often and they're staying with friends or moving all over the place, things like that, we just couldn't even use. So we had to literally be out on the streets. We would spend all day just in one neighborhood trying to find one person.
And Jerry, if I can add to that, as I believe Bryanna mentioned before, Rick Van Thiel also advertised through websites. So it was not only people in the Las Vegas area, but we also had people across state lines in the state of Arizona and in other states. So it also became an issue of trying to find people who didn't want to be found in other states as well. And I know that interviews were done with individuals from other states. But one of the other things I wanted to add is, as we've talked about, because of the public health threat that was involved with this case was not a case that was worked only by the Joint Terrorism Task Force in the Las Vegas FBI. We had detectives from a couple of different jurisdictions, some members of the task force, some detectives from our fusion center out of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. Additionally, we had individuals from our public health department involved with this case because of the public health threat. We had investigators from the medical board because of the issue of practicing medicine without a license. We also had individuals from the county code enforcement because we had mentioned there had been numerous code violations from the property that Rick Van Thiel was living on. So this case wasn't made by a couple of investigators. I think on the day of the search and in the briefings prior to the search, we probably had a room full of about 70 people involved with helping to do the search and with prepping and giving us advice from the medical board and from public health in order to really look at all of the elements of this case.
And additionally, because we were concerned with the spread of infectious disease, we worked with public health and set up an 800 number through the FBI. And public health put out a message that if anyone had had treatment from Rick Van Thiel, to please call this 800 number, and public health was going to do infectious disease testing for free for these individuals if they wanted that done, and to get that message out. And that went on not only in Nevada, but we also had that message out in our neighboring states because of the reach that Rick Van Thiel's marketing went to and in getting people to come and have procedures done by him.
I think one of the interesting things about this case for me is, of course, you had enough probable cause and information from victims in order to get the initial search, but most of your investigation, it sounds, occurred after the search, after Rick Van Thiel knew that you were investigating him. I wonder if that played any part in the investigation as far as him reaching out to victims or trying in any way to stop you from obtaining additional evidence.
To my mind, no, it didn't. I mean, Rick had a big following, and he was also almost too narcissistic where he didn't feel like he needed to go out and tell people, support me. He had that inherently in him. He felt like, oh, of course they're going to support me. I didn't do anything wrong. And a lot of times they did. There were a lot of people that even when we tried explaining, these are the implications and this is what can happen. And please, sometimes we would even say, if you don't want to testify today, that's fine, but please go get yourself tested. Please go see public health. We would hand them these flyers, and a lot of times they would just say, not interested. So it was difficult trying to convince people. One of the bigger concerns we had was if people didn't know that they were infected, who they may then be spreading it to, which seems very relevant today. But back then we were, saying to them, even if they necessarily didn't want to testify against Rick, we were basically pleading with them, please get tested. Please go see the Department of Health. Here's their information. They'll test you for free. Some people were very appreciative and happy to take that up and, were obviously very upset by what happened to them. But some people out of, loyalty to Rick and because they thought, he'd have done nothing wrong, they didn't trust us. We were giving them these flyers and what we might be up to because we were doing that, and they didn't want to go do it. Which reminds me of one thing. Rick was in jail and we were trying to collect some specimen for analysis. And so one of the things that we had to do was a buccal swab in his mouth. And it's very simple. It's just a little cotton swab. You just put it in their mouth and you take the sample. So,
and you need a search warrant for that, I take it.
I believe they did have a search warrant, correct. And it was for his DNA in his mouth. And one of the reasons why was they wanted to compare it against some of the, first to see what was the profile of maybe diseases that he had, to see if it compared against some of the other people that he had been seeing. He would also use ozone therapy on himself. So it was potential that he was giving some of his own diseases to other people. But it was for a variety of other reasons, such as comparing his DNA to the DNA found on the gun. But they asked me if I wanted to do it. And, I was a new agent, so I'm very happy. I was happy to say yes to everything, to get the experience and to learn. And so I said, yeah, and as I'm doing this, one of the things Rick said to me is, you're not putting a bug or a chip in my head, are you? You're an FBI agent. And I was like, no, Rick, we're literally just swabbing you for your DNA. That's all.
Wow. I guess that gives you a real indication of that mindset that the government can't be trusted and the government is up to anything.
Exactly. And that helps you to further understand why so many of the people that went to see him were so distrustful of us, even when we were there trying to help.
Well, you mentioned something about him being in jail. At what point was he arrested? Was there a period of time that he knew he was being investigated and he was out? And if that's the case, was he still performing these medical procedures?
He was still performing medical procedures. And as mentioned, we did the search warrant. He knew we were looking at him. But one of the biggest concerns we had in this case was, again, he was continuing to perform these procedures. And we had a real fear of someone dying because of these procedures. So through the district attorney's office, a grand jury was convened and we were able to get charges brought against him. Unfortunately, not any murder charges, but we looked at more assault and endangerment of children because he was treating minors, people who were under 18 years old, and that was primarily the abortions that he was doing. So we were able to get a grand jury indictment and then go forth from the district attorney's office and get an arrest warrant for him, because that was our biggest concern, to get him off of the streets, out of that house, and not performing these medical procedures. So it was probably really only a couple of weeks between the time the search warrant was done and then the arrest was done, and getting him so he wasn't performing these procedures anymore. And just one other insight I'd like to give you into the mind of Rick Van Thiel. We kind of told you already that he fashioned himself as this Renaissance man, if you will, that he was this jailhouse lawyer for other sovereign citizens, appearing with them in court. He believed himself to be a physician. He was a porn actor. Well, he also decided that he knew enough about the law that he was going to represent himself. So
I should have guessed that.
yeah, exactly. So the judge did assign a public defender to be there to assist him or to help, but he pretty much represented himself. And that really slowed the process, because he would not be prepared or file a motion for an extension or file a motion to get evidence thrown out and all these sorts of things as the attorney representing himself that he fashioned himself to be. So more into the mind of how he thought and how he really was so distrusting. He didn't even trust the public defender that was assigned to him throughout this process.
Yeah, that's taking it very far. When you were talking about the abortions, was he performing these abortions on underage girls?
Yes, he was performing on the abortions on some underage females. Unfortunately, oftentimes the mother would bring the underage child in. And again, it was a case they didn't have insurance. They couldn't afford to have an abortion. So he would perform these abortions on these underage minor females.
With parent permission.
Sometimes, yes.
Wow.
And one of the things which Bryanna had alluded to is he would do these abortions in the nude, and he would also perform what we felt was sexual acts on these girls and tell them that he had to do that for them to expel all of the products of the abortion. So he was basically sexually assaulting them as he was doing these abortions.
Wow. It sounds to me like, and of course, I'm not a doctor or a psychiatrist, but it sounds like his medical procedures was part of his sexual preference and identity. It all seems to be tied up together, almost like a sadist kind of situation. You don't have to comment.
My research since before I went into the Bureau and more notably since I've been in the Bureau today has focused on these types of offenders and psychopathy and narcissism. And in my personal opinion, I think that it was a little bit of him, feeling this grandiosity and he felt like he could do anything and he was above the law and that no rules applied to him. Anything he set his mind to. And also a little bit of thrill seeking and pushing the limits a little bit and trying to see exactly what he could get away with, which, every time he upped the ante, like, oh, I'm going to perform a surgery. Well, now I'm going to perform a surgery in the nude. Well, now I'm going to perform a surgery in the nude and put it on YouTube. I mean, he just kept escalating. And so it really felt like a situation where there was no end. He was just going to keep doing it. And eventually someone was going to die right there in his arms.
Well, now I'm really curious because you have this type of person with this mindset. And here you are, a brand new agent. How did he react to you? Here you are now as an authority figure coming in and being a part of the search and the arrest and victim interviews. How did you feel he reacted to you and respected your authority, or did he?
Rick and I had, if you will, a unique relationship. There was something about me, I think, being a woman that maybe he was more willing to talk to me. Perhaps also that I was younger and a new agent. Maybe he didn't feel like he needed to, assert his authority as much, or maybe he just felt like he was smarter than me or better than me. But for whatever reason, we wanted to use that to our advantage. For instance, when we were riding, I was riding with him and the detective who was my partner on the case and another agent from when we had arrested him. And I'm sitting in the back seat with Rick. I couldn't believe it, but I'm, sitting there, talking to him. And, he's talking to me like I'm an old pal. And I think that he was almost in a way underestimating, the fact that I'm an FBI agent. He almost like was talking to me because he wanted to brag, if you will, and show me just what a amazing, this Renaissance man that he was, and really forgetting, if you will, that I'm federal law enforcement and we would use everything that he said against him.
I love when that happens, don't you?
Yes, loved it.
Yeah, keep them talking. Go ahead. Very nice. All right. So as far as the trial is concerned, do you have an opportunity to testify in the trial? And I also am very curious. I'm so curious about this whole case. This whole thing is just fascinating to me. But I'm also curious, with him acting as his own attorney, how his victims, when they testify, how they react to him.
Well, I guess it's a bad ending, a good ending, I don't know, depending on how you look at it. But even though the case went to grand jury, as Terry mentioned, his trial was set, I think it was for 2018. He never went to trial because he hung himself while he was in jail in 2017. So the victims never saw their day in court, where they got to confront him. He was never, convicted. So that obviously was not good because you would have liked to have him be found guilty for everything that he'd done. However, at the same time, you have to feel for the victims that didn't want to testify, that were scared to testify, that, just didn't want to relive it. And so in a way, they felt like maybe they didn't have to do it and they felt better that they didn't.
Wow, you just dropped a climatic ending to the story I wasn't expecting. So his antics in court, those were all pretrial motions and hearings where you were anticipating what it's going to be like when you actually went to trial. Tell us more about him committing suicide. I take it this is when he was in custody.
Yeah, he was in custody. He had been doing all kinds of things while he was in jail. In fact, he was still practicing medicine on other inmates while he was in jail. He was making phone calls and doing consultations. He just, never stopped. And so it was, in a way, further indication of his narcissism, right? He thought, even though we're clearly, listening to his jail calls, he would write letters, to his mother and other people and, say, don't worry, I'm going to get out of this. He had all the confidence in the world. But I think that in some cases, when people who are very narcissistic like that, and they can, keep up the act until eventually there's a day where they realize it's real. And in some cases, that's just too hard for them to deal with. And, research that I've done and I've read suggests that people who have that high level of narcissism sometimes will opt for suicide as the way out of it. So they never have to really admit or see themselves being held responsible for their actions. An example of this will be Jeffrey Epstein, who, also hung himself while he was in jail waiting trial.
And just one thing to add to that is the fact that Rick felt that he should be able to be released on his own recognizance. So during the hearing, the judge basically told him that he would not be released, that he was a danger to society. And I don't remember the exact words that he used, but Rick told the judge that he didn't believe that, and that was an opinion, and that was her opinion, that he was not a danger to society. So even to a judge who, most of us as citizens of the United States respect the judges, he didn't even respect the judge during his hearings.
Fascinating. So, and I know this is kind of, I guess, insensitive to say, but one of the things that agents always say is how devastating it is for an investigation to have your subject die before, you get the conviction statistics. I can't imagine that it was not anticlimactic for you to go through all of this, and as an agent and as the, agent supervisor who spent so much time working on this case, seems, like there's a little bit of a letdown and a disappointment that you're not going to be able to go through the whole prosecutor procedure and have this person be convicted.
We did feel that way, and we had a lot of concern for the victims, that they would feel that they never got the day in court got justice. So it became very important, especially for the lead detective, task force officer on this case, to go out after this occurred and talk to the victims' families or the victims. And oftentimes, first of all, they were thankful that the detective went out and talked to them and said, it is a little bit of justice that he did commit suicide, although they would have liked to have seen it go through the court process. But they really appreciated it. And, unfortunately, in a case like this, you really become close with those victims and the victim's family. And one particular lady, her son had HIV, and Rick had convinced her son to go off of the HIV treatment and to take this ozone therapy, and he ended up dying. So she's like, I don't have my son with me anymore, but I really got to know the investigators on the case and appreciate it, that they were really just trying to do the right thing and get Rick Van Thiel off the streets and stop doing these procedures that were endangering people. So that did provide us with some satisfaction.
Bryanna?
Yeah, it was, I would say, an ending. I would say when I found out, when I heard the news, I was not surprised. There was something that I almost felt like, of course, that's what happened. It almost seemed like I thought that was going to happen, but I didn't really think it was going to happen, but it did. And in a way, there was all of the, mental energy and things that we were worried about, going into trial and preparations. And, in a way it was like, well, at least now he's not going to hurt anyone else. That was one of my concerns. Even when he was in jail, as I mentioned, he was still performing these types of either consultations or telling people, when you get out, this is what you need to do. Or, he was even trying to do these little, surgeries while he was in the jail. And so you just want to think like, yeah, at least now it's going to be over. And that was probably the first and second thought. And the third one was just feeling sad for the victims that did want to testify or did want to see him, go away and be in prison, but now wouldn't be able to. But at least they would also know he wouldn't do it to anyone else.
Well, this has been a fascinating case review, and I knew it would when I initially heard that it was a medical fraud case that had been investigated by the Joint Terrorism Task Force in Las Vegas. I was like, what? And I know that the case is significant enough or fascinating enough that it ended up as an episode on the TV show License to Kill. Could you tell us how that came about?
Certainly. That came about because the producers and the group that does tape that show, they do research looking for medical endangerment, medical fraud types of cases. So the producers had contacted the district attorney who prosecuted this case or was in the process of prosecuting this case and requested interviews and that they would like to do an episode specifically on Rick Van Thiel because it was just such an egregious case. They, had seen a lot and had seen, unfortunately, licensed medical professionals that went bad and were endangering their patients, but they'd never really seen anything like this. And I would add, this was the first time that I had ever seen sovereign citizens doing their own medical procedures like Rick Van Thiel was doing. So it had a lot of intrigue. And then when you add him having been a porn star and the assault and just the very complex and different perspectives of this case. So the district attorney's office, as the prosecutors, agreed that it would be a good case to highlight, especially to let people know you need to really research people before you go and have procedures, especially by unlicensed professionals or unlicensed people that are doing these. So the district attorney's office contacted the detective task force officer from Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. And then he, of course, contacted me as his former supervisor because we worked this case off of the Joint Terrorism Task Force. So unfortunately, I had hoped that we could have some charges against him in terms of from the terrorism side because he was touting this to sovereign citizens and to other like-minded anti-government people. It just really didn't work that way from the federal side, but it was satisfying to know that we were able to get him to stop doing these procedures at the end of the day.
What's the name of the episode? I know that it is available for viewing on Amazon Prime for the low price of $2.99.
The name, I think the description on it was an underground radical that was performing medical procedures without a license. I don't remember the exact name.
Season 2, Episode 2.
Excellent. And I will put a link to the episode, so anybody who has Amazon Prime will be able to just click on the link and view the episode if they want additional details about this case. So we're at the point now of the interview where I find out a little bit more about you two. Why don't we start with Terry first? My question to you is, when did you join the FBI and why did you join the FBI?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that. Prior to becoming a special agent with the FBI, I was a registered nurse and had worked as a registered nurse for almost 11 years. And I worked a variety of different nursing areas. I worked medical surgical nursing, intensive care unit nursing, nursing staff development. But my last position as a nurse was working in the area of donation and transplantation. I worked on the donation end, so whenever someone died, if their family wanted to donate tissue or organs, I was the one who would go out and talk to the families, deal with the coroner or medical examiner to get their permission to be able to take the donation. So I got to know a lot of homicide detectives because the majority of the deaths that we dealt with in that position were either suicides, accidental deaths, or they weren't necessarily usually from natural causes. So oftentimes they were investigated, and always thought it would be really interesting to be a homicide detective. However, as we all know, to be a homicide detective, you have to be a street cop first, but that really wasn't what I wanted to do. And I got to know the medical examiner, and they said, you should really go and talk to the feds because it sounds like that would be the best path for you from the homicide detectives and then from the medical examiner in the county that I worked in. So I did go and talk to a recruiter. And at the time, this is really dating myself, but back in 1995, 96, healthcare fraud was a big initiative for the FBI, like to recruit people who understood medical billing, those sorts of things. So after going through the process to become an FBI agent, my first 3 years in the FBI, I worked healthcare fraud. So used my background to help with my investigations. And that's why I especially found this case so egregious, because I'd never seen anything like this coming from the medical profession. So I will say that after I entered duty as an FBI agent, I had a bachelor's degree in nursing. And the FBI, through the tuition reimbursement program, paid for my master's in nursing. And then for my PhD is in emergency management. I worked in the FBI laboratory and the hazardous materials response unit for about 10 years as part of my career in the FBI because they wanted agents that had a science background. So I fit nicely into that arena, and it was very interesting and was able to use the emergency management in that position within the FBI. I thank the FBI for my higher education that they paid for, and that was very useful.
Excellent. Is that where you met your husband, Scott Decker?
That is where I met my husband, Scott Decker. He was an investigator on the anthrax, the Amerithrax case. And he and I met because I was one of the supervisory special agents in the hazardous materials response unit who often worked that case and assisted them in search warrants and crime scene investigations. So yes, that is where I met him.
Well, I know for a fact that, he's very proud of your contributions to the FBI because he was the one who reached out to me saying, you need to interview Terry Kerns, about her medical fraud case. And so I want to thank Scott for connecting us together. And of course, you also for agreeing to come on. What are you doing now? So you retired recently, was it?
I retired from the Las Vegas division of the Joint Terrorism Task Force of the FBI in October of 2017. I retired and went to a position with the Nevada Office of the Attorney General. The position that I'm in there it goes by various names, but most commonly is the opioid coordinator for the state of Nevada. And in that position, I function to try to get law enforcement, first responders, healthcare, and public health officials all working in the same direction and their programs going in the same direction and funding it started as the opioid crisis, but it's become the drug crisis. It's not just opioids anymore. So much of my experience that I had as both a nurse and in the FBI really led me right into this position that I'm currently in.
Very interesting. I know a retired agent listening or somebody who knows a retired agent who has a case that deals with the drug crisis, especially when it comes to the prescription, over prescribing prescription cases. I would love for someone to contact me because I'd love to do that type of case. Bryanna, I'm also very interested in hearing from you about when you joined the FBI and why you joined the FBI.
Thanks, Jerry. I had an unusual, entry into the FBI. I did not want to be an FBI agent. I initially thought I was going to be a lawyer or a prosecutor, and I applied to be an honors intern when I was in college. And I said in my letter why I applied to become an FBI honors intern, because I was interested in becoming a U.S. attorney, and, I had interest in getting experience, with the FBI, since they would be partners, if I became a U.S. attorney. And I couldn't believe, they actually picked me, maybe because I was honest, but I got into the honors internship program, and that really changed my perception on everything. I thought, for me to be able to be on the ground, to be making cases, and most importantly to me, understanding, why people do what they do and trying to prevent it meant a lot to me. So it just felt like a better fit. But I knew I had to really up my, education and experience to be able to get into the FBI. So I really took a strange path. I went to grad school. I worked on my master's, and then I got my PhD from the University of Cambridge in England. During my master's, I was presenting at a conference, and the work that I was doing was related to offender profiling and some of the behavioral analysis that could help us to identify suspects and limit down a suspect pool in various cases. And when I was presenting, I had these two people come up to me, wearing suits. It was almost like out of a movie. And they said, "Hey, we would really like to talk to you about your work. Would you mind talking to us over dinner?" And they said, "We're from the FBI's behavioral science unit." And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm either being punked or this is like the day of my dreams. They spoke to me, and at the end of the conversation said they wanted to invite me to become a research fellow in the BSU in Quantico, which was literally a dream come true. And I thought, that was going to be it. I thought that was wonderful, and that was the end of the line for me. And so while I was doing my PhD, I was working with them in the behavioral science unit. I took the elevator, Clarice Starling was in, down 60 feet. We taught in the National Academy. It was one of the best experiences I had, just getting to be there and learn from them and also continue on my research. Then I finished my PhD, and they, by that time, really convinced me that I should become an FBI agent. I knew I wanted to work in the FBI, but I really didn't know that I wanted to be an agent. I applied, and just to put it simply, I had worked in the BSU, I had a PhD, and I remember the day they said, you're unskilled. So I was like, okay, I got to get more skills. So I got a job at a university. I was teaching and working with law enforcement training and trying to further my research. And about 2 years later, I get a call kind of out of the blue, and they said, are you still interested in being an agent? And I, again, thought I was being punked. And so I said, absolutely. And, went through the whole process. Luckily, because my background check from the first two positions I had in the Bureau was still active, it went relatively fast after that. And so I started in the academy, and then I was assigned to the Las Vegas office to the organized crime and narcotics squad, which I was later assigned to, but I was involved in this case as an early rotation and getting exposure to different things in the office.
And at some point, you decided to resign as a special agent. Could you tell us more about that decision? The FBI has like a 1% attrition rate for agents. And so we're always curious when someone decides to resign.
I had a 2-year leave of absence from my university where I still, owned my home and had family. But I can tell you one thing, one reason that wasn't related to me resigning, and that was Terry Kerns. She was an incredible supervisor and, more importantly, a fantastic role model for me as a young female agent. I really admired learning and working for Terry and seeing all that she did, and she was just incredible to me. So Terry made it hard for me to leave the FBI, but there were other reasons that just took me away.
Now, you're doing unbelievable work that still relates to law enforcement.
I'm a professor in the Department of Criminology at the University of South Florida. It's really a great job because I have the privilege of still working with federal, state, and local law enforcement, collaborate on a variety of projects, one of which we just received $1.2 million from the National Institute of Justice to prevent recidivism amongst prolific offenders. I have another grant with the local police department where we received about $1 million to prevent repeat gun offenders and prolific opioid and drug traffickers from continuing their behavior. So for me, it's really important to understand, why people are doing this. What can law enforcement do to better prevent this from happening? And ultimately, how can we make our community safer? So while my job title has changed and certainly, what I do on a day-to-day basis has changed, I'd like to think that my overall goal and what I'm trying to do, for a living and for society really hasn't.
Excellent. I like to give my guests the opportunity to have the last word. Bryanna, I'd like for you to go first. What would you like to be your parting words of wisdom?
One of the things that we kept hearing about in this case when we would talk to people who wanted to talk to us was, they said, I couldn't believe I didn't listen to my gut. When I was walking into that place and it just looked wrong and what he asked me to do just didn't seem right. I don't know why I didn't say no. And, I honestly do not fault them. I think about it a lot whenever this case comes up. What would I do if I was in that situation? I hope I would be strong enough and, brave enough to say something and to walk away. But it's just a reminder for me and hopefully a reminder for your listeners that, it takes courage to do that and to try to do it and to, encourage other people around you to always do the right thing or to do what your gut tells you because it's probably right.
And Terry?
My last words would be that I really believe that even as an FBI agent, we're not always the first responders. We're not the first ones on scene. Oftentimes we are dealing with a little more complex cases, not what you think of traditional first responder law enforcement, but a career in the FBI is really what you make of it. And it was a great experience for me, which I'm glad I've had. And I keep saying, what do I want to be when I grow up? It is opened up doors and given me opportunities. And I fell into what I saw was a dream job after retiring for the FBI. And it's really, in my opinion, a helping profession. It's, law enforcement in the face of law enforcement are changing, but there still is a role for what we do. And to the point of some of Bryanna's research, we need to look at some things. And I'm working in the field of substance use disorder now. If we can prevent some of these crimes and get people help, maybe we won't end up putting them all in jail.
And that's the end of the interview. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Terry Kerns and Bryanna Fox. There are numerous links to articles and videos about this case, even one, if you want to look at it, of Dr. Rick performing surgery, of course, in the nude. The show notes also feature exterior and interior photos of that filthy, dirty trailer where he met with and operated on his patients/victims. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. If they're not sure how to listen to a podcast, have them read the post on my website, How to Listen to a Podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. I would also love it if you checked out the link for my books in your podcast app's description of this episode. My nonfiction books, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, which goes through 20 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. And then there's the companion book, FBI Word Search Puzzles, Fun for Armchair Detectives. My FBI Philadelphia Corruption Squad crime series features flawed female FBI agent Carrie Wheeler in Pay to Play and Greedy Givers. All of my books are available wherever books are sold as ebooks, print books, and audiobooks. If you've already picked up copies of my books, please consider leaving a review. Reviews help readers find good books. Thank you for listening to the very end, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.